Hello. My name is Alexi. I'm your lecturer for this episode of the RKMCS Criminology Lecture Series. Our topic for today is about the history of prisons. I hope that at the end of my presentation, you could be able to remember your studies about how the early prisons and jails were developed into our modern penal systems. In order for me to be concise, but direct to the point enough for a short lecture, allow me to group my presentation into two parts. Firstly, I'll present the early prisons based on their historical popularity, and by known date of their establishment. This will permit you to recall the development of modern prisons, according to their timeline. Secondly, I'm going to share the notable pioneers of prison reforms and their advocates. So, let us start with the first part, the early prisons and their development. They are as follows. Mammartine Prison or Carcere Mammartino of 600 BC. This is the oldest known prison that can be traced back to ancient Rome's series of dungeons. The carcer was the only prison in ancient Rome. When someone was sentenced to death, they were brought here to await execution. This was the site of the imprisonments of the Apostle Paul and the Apostle Peter. It was originally designed as a reservoir for water. Accordingly, the Apostle Peter caused the well water to spring up so that he might baptize his jailers. Next is the Licensure Prison, built in the 1290s in Florence, Italy. It housed male inmates separately from female inmates, and also segregated inmates by age group, degree of sanity, and severity of offense. It served as a political prison, a debtor's prison, and a judicial prison. While earlier prisons in Florence were initially privately operated, Licensure was communally organized and funded from its inception. Another early prison is the Château d'If, built in 1524. A fortress that was built on the rocky island of If, 2 miles off the French port of Marseille. In 1580 it was taken into use as a state prison for those convicted of serious political and religious crimes. It was an ideal place as a prison primarily because of the fact it was an island and difficult to escape from. There are fast currents that run through the surrounding waters, which acted as a deterrent, very similar to the island prison of Alcatraz, in San Francisco. Next is the Bridewell Prison. The Bridewell Prison was the first house of correction in England. Originally built as a royal palace for Henry VIII in 1515. Edward VI gave Bridewell to the City of London in 1553. It became a popular workhouse in London for the employment and housing of English prisoners by 1557. By early 1700s, prevalence of early forms of punishments included transportation of criminal offenders, indentured servitude and economic sanctions, public humiliation, pillory, stocks and ducking stools, and medieval executions. Even the early period of the House of Correction for Boys in the Hospice of St. Michael in Rome, and the Maison de Force in Ghent, Belgium, were very famous places of incarceration. Inmates were whipped and had to adhere to the rule of silence. These places of confinement were considered to be ideal models of the prison institution at the time. John Howard, a Christian activist and an English philanthropist, fought for prison reform. In 1748, he left England to tour France and Italy. He inspected jails in order to ensure that prisoners received humane treatment. The jails were very small with few inmates, and these institutions were operated under a fee system. As a result of the testimony that John Howard provided to a committee of the House of Commons, Parliament passed the 1774 Jail Act. The terms of this legislation abolished the fees and suggested ways for improving the sanitary state of prisons and the better preservation of the health of the prisoners. Next is the Walnut Street Prison, which was a city jail and penitentiary house in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, from 1773 to 1838. Legislation calling for establishment of the jail was passed in 1773 in order to relieve overcrowding in the High Street Jail. Here, the first prisoners were admitted in 1776. In 1790, the panopticon idea was introduced by Jeremy Bentham, the proponent of the utilitarian hedonism theory, which he suggested that laws should be evaluated to ensure that they are ethical and useful. His design of a model prison was referred to as the panopticon. The panopticon is a type of institutional building in a system of control designed. The concept of the design is to allow an observer to observe all prisoners without the prisoners being able to tell if they are being observed or not. For 20 years he tried to build it. In the end he failed, but the story of his attempt offers fascinating insights into both Bentham's complex character and the ideas of the period. In New York City, The first state penitentiary was the Newgate Prison, operational from 1797 to 1829, influenced the second state penitentiary of Auburn Prison, which was constructed in 1816 at Auburn, New York. The Auburn Prison was classified as a maximum prison facility. It became the site of the first electric chair execution in 1890. The Auburn Prison adopted a congregate system where a rule of silence was enforced to keep the prisoners from corrupting one another. There was strict control and severe discipline were common. Whipping was a common practice. This congregate system was also adopted at the Sing Sing Penitentiary when opened in 1826 in New York. Another early prison is the Eastern State Penitentiary, built on the outskirts of Philadelphia. The Eastern State Penitentiary became operational from 1829 until 1971. Prisoners were in solitary confinement. This model was referred as an isolate system. The isolate system was based from the idea that solitary confinement and penance would lead to rehabilitation of prisoners. Prisoners were also given a work detail which consisted of handicrafts. In California at the San Francisco Bay, the infamous Alcatraz Prison was constructed as a maximum security facility in 1859. It was established originally as a military facility, but the U.S. Army transferred it to the Federal Bureau of Prison and became a prison facility in 1934 until it was closed in 1963. The Alcatraz Prison was famous as the Rock for being a last resort prison to hold the worst of the worst who had no hope of rehabilitation. From its 29 years of operation, a total of 36 prisoners made 14 escape attempts, but failed. Prisoners Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, successfully escaped, but they were never found. Now, let's go to France. Of the same period of the middle 1800s, the Devil's Island, also known as Isle du Diable, was opened in 1852 and became the most notorious prison in the world, in terms of the harshness of its regime and position. The island is situated in the Atlantic off the coast of French Guiana and was in use from 1852 until it was closed in 1953. The Devil's Island system was infamous for its harsh treatment of detainees, with a death rate of almost 75%. It was also being used for internal exile of French political prisoners, with the most famous being Captain Alfred Dreyfus. In December 1894, French officer Alfred Dreyfus was convicted of treason and sentenced to life in this prison, for his alleged crime of passing military secrets to the Germans. Back to the United States, the Indiana State Reformatory, opened in 1860 in Michigan City, to be the first separate female prison. Before instituting the first female prison, women were housed with men. They also received the same punishment as men. For that reason, women were preyed upon by both inmates and prison guards. In the early female prisons, women were often housed in cottages. The conditions for women in state prisons remained the same. They were subject to abuse and often required to endure long hours of hard labor. Notably, one of the most famous prisoners to be in the Michigan City prison was bank robber John Dillinger, who was released on parole in 1933. Next, we have the Elmira Reformatory, which set up the Elmira system. The Elmira Reformatory was opened in 1876 in Elmira, New York. It differed from many prisons during those days. It focused on reforming the convict using psychological methods rather than physical sufferings. It sought to reform and rehabilitate. The prison system was designed to house young men. It was believed that younger prisoners were capable of rehabilitation. An academic program was put in place and athletics was encouraged. The silent system was not used, rather a reward system was used. The reformatory was run by famous Superintendent Zebulon Brockway. From here, let us proceed to the second part of my presentation. As you may have noticed, important names of the pioneering advocates of penal reformation were mentioned earlier. So, I shall now discuss about the people who contributed much in the prison reform era. They are as follows. Number 1 in my list is William Penn. 1614 to 1718. He fought for religious freedom and individual rights. He was the first leader to prescribe imprisonment as correctional treatment for major offenders. He also fought for the abolition of death penalty and torture as a form of punishment. Number 2. Charles Louis de Secunda Baron de la Bretette de Montesquieu, or simply known as Charles Montesquieu. 1689 to 1755. A French historian and philosopher who analyzed law as an expression of justice. He believed that harsh punishment would undermine morality and that appealing to moral sentiments was the better means of preventing crime. Montesquieu was also famous for his advocacy against slavery as a means of punishment. He was famous for the theory of the separation of powers between the legislative, judiciary and the executive branches of government. Number 3. François-Marie Arouet, whose pen name was Voltaire. 1694–1778. A French Enlightenment writer, historian, and philosopher famous for his wit, his criticism of Christianity, especially the Roman Catholic Church, as well as his advocacy of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and separation of church and state. He was the most versatile of all philosophers during this period. He believed that fear of shame was a deterrent to crime. He also fought the legality-sanctioned practice of torture. Number 4. Cesare Bonassana di Beccaria. 1738–1794. He was regarded as the father of traditional or classical criminology. He wrote the essay, An Essay on Crimes and Punishment, the most exciting essay on law during this period of time. His essay presented the humanistic goals of law, which eventually became the strongest foundation of modern penal systems. Number 5. Jeremy Bentham. 1748–1832. He was the greatest leader in the reform of English criminal law. He believed that whatever punishment designed to negate whatever pleasure or gain the criminal derives from crime, the crime rate would go down. If you can recall the panopticon idea I presented earlier, that prison design was Bentham's famous prison model, which was later on considered by modern prison architects, although the panopticon was an architectural concept intended as a disciplinary mechanism. Number 6. John Howard. 1726–1790. He was the Sheriff of Bedfordshire in 1773 who devoted his life and fortune to prison reform. After his findings on English prisons, he recommended that single cells for sleeping, segregation of women, segregation of youth, provision of sanitation facilities, and the abolition of fee system. It was for his efforts that made him famous as the father of prison reformation. By the time of the 1800s, the golden age of penology comes in. Parole began at the close of the 1800s. When it was constituted, many prisoners were already receiving clemency, pardons and early departure for safe conduct. Parole began with reformatories but spread to all prisons. From the works of the pioneers of prison reform, came the application of their ideas from the efforts of known modern prison reformers such as. In 1813, Elizabeth Frye worked to improve the conditions for women who were incarcerated. She was known to be the first woman prison reformer. Manuel Montesinos, the director of the prisons of Valencia, Spain in 1835, who divided prisoners into companies and appointed prisoners as petty officers in charge. A practice adopted in modern prisons to the present. Captain Alexander McConaughey, the superintendent of a penal colony at Norfolk Island in Australia who introduced the mark system. McConaughey was considered one of the fathers of modern penology. Some scholars even gave him the fame as the father of parole, considering that the mark system was the forerunner of the modern practice of parole. Sir Walter Crofton, chairman of the directors of Irish prisons. In 1856, Crofton introduced the Irish system, a change of the McConaughey's mark system, which was later on called the progressive point system. This is likewise equivalent to present-day practice of parole. Frederick Auguste Damitz. He was famous for the establishment of an agricultural colony for delinquent boys in France in 1839. The boys were housed in cottages with house fathers as in charge. Zebulon Brockway. He was superintendent of the Elmira Reformatory in 1876. The Elmira system had all the elements of modern correctional facility. So, the institution is often referred to as the forerunner of modern penology. For his efforts, Brockway gains the fame as the father of the American parole system. In 1878, John Augustus, a humble shoemaker, advocated the fair treatment of criminals. He housed offenders who were sentenced to prison, a practice of the probation system. The actual legal statute for probation was passed first by Massachusetts in 1878. This made John Augustus as famous father of probation. Sir Evelyn Ruggles Brazé, a director of English prisons, who, after visiting Elmira in 1897, opened the Borstal Institution of England, which became the earliest best reform institutions for young offenders. Then came the 20th century. In 1945, the treatment era was introduced. During this post-war boom, There was an interest to reform prisons. After conducting research, it was determined that a medical model should be used in the prison system. Prisoners were considered ill and the cure would be rehabilitation through treatment. By 1967, the community-based era became more popular. A more humanistic approach was envisioned. The community-based approach would help the inmate, and it would help solve the problem of overcrowding prisons. Inmates took part in halfway houses and job release programs. There you go. The history of prisons and the development of modern penal system. Thank you for watching. I hope you were able to relearn your correctional management studies. Please follow us at Facebook, and subscribe at our YouTube channel for more videos. Visit our website at www.criminologysolutions.com.